Blackwells Open Hand. Arlington, 1921. Catherine Montgomery visited Sergeant Lucas Beckett's grave, expecting silence. Instead, she found a man's ring resting atop the headstone. It wasn't Lucas. And inside the band, an engraving. Find Me. Chapter 1. The Ring and the Whispers of the Past. The Arlington air, crisp with the promise of autumn, carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Catherine Montgomery stood before Sergeant Lucas Beckett's headstone, the granite cold beneath her gloved fingertips. 3 years. 3 years since the telegram had arrived, stark white against the vibrant hues of their small London flat, shattering the illusion of forever they had so carefully crafted. 3 years since the world had shifted, leaving her adrift in a sea of muted colors and half-forgotten dreams. She hadn't expected the silence to be broken. Arlington, in 1921, was a place of hushed reverence, of quiet mourning. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the muffled sobs of another visitor, these were the sounds she had anticipated. Not the metallic glint of something foreign nestled amongst the carefully placed poppies she'd brought. Catherine knelt, her black mourning dress pooling around her on the meticulously manicured grass. It was a man's ring, heavy and silver, tarnished with age but undeniably cared for. It wasn't Lucas. Lucas had worn a simple gold band, a promise exchanged in a hurried ceremony before he shipped out, a band that now resided on a chain around her neck, a constant weight against her heart. This ring was different, more ornate, with a subtle, almost hidden design etched into the surface, a stylized bird, wings outstretched in flight. A shiver traced its way down her spine. It wasn't just the unexpectedness of the ring. It was the feeling it evoked, a prickling unease that settled deep in her bones. Carefully, she picked it up. The metal was cool to the touch, surprisingly heavy. Turning it over, she examined the inner band. There, barely visible beneath the layer of tarnish, was an inscription. 2 words, etched in a delicate, flowing script. Find me. Her breath caught in her throat. Find me? Who? And why leave it here, on Lucas's grave? A wave of dizziness washed over her, the neatly ordered rows of headstones blurring around the edges. She gripped the ring tighter, the cold metal grounding her. The war had taken so much. Lucas, her vibrant, laughing Lucas, reduced to a name carved in stone. Her brother, Edward, lost in the mud of the Somme. Her faith in a benevolent God, shattered by the endless casualty lists. But it had also left behind mysteries, unanswered questions that whispered in the quiet corners of her mind. She traced the inscription with her thumb. Find me. The words were a plea, a desperate cry across the chasm of war and loss. But they were also a command, a summons she couldn't ignore. The ring felt charged, imbued with a significance she couldn't yet comprehend. Catherine had spent the past 3 years building walls around her heart, brick by painstaking brick. Grief had been her constant companion, a familiar ache she had learned to live with. She worked as a librarian, surrounded by the comforting silence of books, the predictable order of knowledge. Her life was a carefully constructed routine designed to keep the chaos of the past at bay. But this ring, it was a crack in those meticulously built walls. A sliver of light in the carefully cultivated darkness. A sound, the crunch of gravel, startled her. She looked up, her heart pounding against her ribs. A man was approaching, his figure tall and lean against the backdrop of the setting sun. He was dressed in a well-worn tweed suit, his face obscured by the shadow of a fedora. As he drew closer, she could make out the lines etched around his eyes, the hint of gray at his temples. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, a subtle stiffness that hinted at a military past. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the headstone, not on her. Sergeant Beckett, he said, his voice a low rumble, tinged with a faint accent she couldn't quite place. A good man. A brave man. Catherine remained silent, clutching the ring in her hand. Her instincts, honed by years of navigating a world suddenly filled with uncertainty, screamed at her to be cautious. He finally looked at her, his eyes, a startling shade of blue, filled with a depth of sadness that mirrored her own. "You were close to him?" he asked, the question gentle, almost hesitant. "He was my husband," Catherine replied, her voice barely a whisper. The words still felt strange, foreign, even after all this time. The man nodded, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. I knew him. Briefly. In France. France. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken memories. Catherine felt a tremor run through her. This man, this stranger, had walked the same battlefields, breathed the same air thick with smoke and fear as Lucas. He seemed to sense her unease. "I apologize if I'm intruding," he said, taking a step back. I wanted to pay my respects." Catherine hesitated. She should leave. She should go back to her quiet apartment, to the safety of her books. But the ring, still clutched tightly in her hand, pulsed with a strange warmth. "Find me. Did you leave something here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. She held out her hand, the ring glinting in the fading light. The man's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise, then recognition, washing over his face. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers as he took the ring. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a sensation she hadn't felt in years. He examined the ring, turning it over and over in his hands. This is impossible," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Who are you?" Catherine asked, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. The walls she had so carefully constructed were crumbling, and she was powerless to stop it. The man looked up at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and something else. Something that sent a shiver of both fear and anticipation down her spine. He opened his mouth to speak, then hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions, with the ghosts of the past. Finally, he looked from the ring up into Catherine's face. His eyes, so blue, so haunted, held the promise of an answer, but also the threat of a storm. Chapter 2. Echoes of Ypres in Arlington. He took a deep breath, the crisp Arlington air seeming to catch in his throat. "My name is Alexander Ainsworth," he said, his voice still low, but steadier now. "And this ring belonged to a friend. A brother in all but blood." Catherine stared at him, the name Ainsworth unfamiliar, yet resonating with a faint, unsettling echo. The ring felt heavier now, a weight of history and untold stories pressing down on her. A brother? But it was on Lucas's grave. Alexander's gaze drifted back to the headstone, a shadow passing over his face. "That's what I don't understand. This ring, it should be buried with its owner. In Ypres. Ypres." The name was a punch to the gut, a city synonymous with unimaginable loss, with the brutal reality of trench warfare. Catherine had seen the photographs, the desolate landscapes, the endless rows of crosses. She had read the letters, Lucas's carefully worded reassurances masking the horrors he must have witnessed. Who was he? Catherine asked, her voice barely a whisper. She needed to know, needed to understand the connection between this stranger, this ring, and her lost husband. Alexander hesitated, his eyes searching hers, as if gauging her strength, her ability to bear the weight of the truth. His name was Captain Thomas Ashton. He was my commanding officer. And my closest friend. Captain Ashton. The name stirred something in the depths of her memory, a fleeting image from a long-ago conversation. Lucas had mentioned a Captain Ashton, hadn't he? A man he admired, a man he respected. But the details were hazy, lost in the fog of grief and time. He died at Ypres? Catherine asked, the question a statement, a confirmation of the inevitable. Alexander nodded, his jaw tight. Third battle. October, 1917. He saved my life. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief, with a survivor's guilt that Catherine knew all too well. She had seen it in the eyes of the returning soldiers, the haunted look that spoke of things they could never unsee, of losses they could never recover. I was there when he fell, Alexander continued, his voice raw with emotion. We were caught in a barrage, shell fire raining down on us. He pushed me into a shell crater, shielding me with his own body. He took the brunt of the blast. Catherine closed her eyes, the image of Lucas's smiling face superimposed on the brutal reality of Alexander's words. She could almost feel the earth trembling beneath her feet, hear the deafening roar of the explosions, smell the acrid stench of gunpowder. I tried to get him to a field hospital, Alexander said, his voice choked with emotion. But it was too late. He died in my arms. Catherine opened her eyes, her own tears blurring her vision. She reached out, her hand instinctively seeking his, a gesture of shared grief, of understanding that transcended words. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting connection in the face of overwhelming loss. I buried him myself, Alexander continued, his voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. Near a small, ruined church. I took his ring. As a memento. A promise to remember him. He looked down at the ring, still clutched tightly in his hand. I haven't taken it off since. Until today. I don't understand how it ended up here. Catherine shook her head, equally bewildered. I don't understand either. I found it just now, lying on Lucas's headstone. A silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the city. The mystery deepened, the connection between their lives, their losses, becoming more tangled, more inexplicable. The inscription, Catherine said, her voice trembling slightly. Find me. What does it mean? Alexander looked up at her, his blue eyes filled with a flicker of hope, a spark of something that had been dormant for years. It was a private joke. Between Thomas and me. We used to talk about after the war. About finding each other, no matter what. It was a foolish dream, I suppose. But it kept us going. A foolish dream. Catherine knew all about those. She had clung to her own foolish dreams, of a life with Lucas, of a future filled with laughter and love. Dreams that had been shattered by the harsh reality of war. But why here? Catherine asked, gesturing to the headstone. Why on Lucas's grave? Alexander shook his head, his brow furrowed in confusion. I don't know. I haven't been back to Arlington since the war ended. I've been avoiding it, I suppose. Too many memories. Too many memories. Catherine understood that too. She had avoided Arlington for months after Lucas's death, unable to face the stark reality of his absence. It was only recently that she had found the courage to return, to seek solace in the quiet serenity of the cemetery. But this was anything but serene. This was a puzzle, a mystery that demanded to be solved. The ring, the inscription, the stranger with the haunted eyes, it was all connected, somehow. And Catherine knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she couldn't rest until she had uncovered the truth. Even if she had to dredge the very depths of her grief and his to get there. The fading sunlight cast long shadows across the grounds, the headstones like silent sentinels. Catherine looked at Alexander, a question burning in her eyes, a challenge, and a plea all at once. He met her gaze, the shared grief a palpable link, and within it, a nascent understanding. He knew it too. Chapter 3. The stranger's face in the cemetery. We need to find out how this happened, Catherine said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. The ring, still in Alexander's possession, seemed to hum with a silent energy, a tangible link to a past that refused to stay buried. Alexander nodded, his blue eyes, usually clouded with a distant sorrow, now held a flicker of determination. I agree. But where do we even begin? Catherine considered the possibilities, her librarian's mind instinctively organizing the fragmented information, searching for a logical starting point. The inscription, find me. It was a promise between you and Captain Ashton. But it also implies a search. A journey. A journey that ended in Ypres, Alexander said, his voice heavy with regret. Or so I thought. Perhaps not, Catherine countered. Perhaps the journey continued. In some way. Through Lucas. The idea hung in the air, fragile yet compelling. Lucas. Her Lucas. Had he known Captain Ashton? Had he known about the ring? Had he somehow become entangled in their unfinished story? Lucas mentioned Captain Ashton in one of his letters, Catherine recalled, the memory surfacing from the depths of her grief. He said he was a good man, a leader, but he didn't say much else. Lucas was a private man, Alexander said, a hint of understanding in his voice. Many soldiers were. They learned to keep their emotions guarded, to protect themselves, and those they loved. Catherine nodded, remembering the carefully worded reassurances in Lucas's letters, the deliberate omissions, the unspoken fears that lurked beneath the surface. He had tried to shield her from the horrors of the war, to preserve the illusion of normalcy, even as his world was collapsing around him. "We need to see those letters," Alexander said, his gaze fixed on Catherine. "They might hold a clue. Something that connects Lucas to the ring, to Captain Ashton's disappearance." Disappearance. The word sent a shiver down Catherine's spine. It implied something more than death, something unresolved. "I have them," Catherine replied. "All of them. At my apartment." She hesitated. Inviting this stranger, this man with the haunted eyes and the tangled past, into her home, it was a risk. But it was a risk she was willing to take. The ring, the inscription, the mystery, it had awakened something within her, a sense of purpose, a need to know the truth. Will you come with me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alexander met her gaze, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. I would be honored," he replied. They walked in silence, the setting sun casting long shadows across the cemetery. The air was cooler now, the scent of damp earth mingling with the faint aroma of Alexander's pipe tobacco. Catherine found herself studying him, trying to decipher the man behind the stoic facade. He was older than Lucas, perhaps by 10 years. His face was lined, not just with age, but with experience, with the hardships he had endured. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, a subtle stiffness that hinted at his military past. But there was also a vulnerability in his eyes, a hint of the pain he had tried so hard to conceal. As they reached the gates of Arlington, Catherine paused, turning to face him. "Why did you come here today?" she asked, the question that had been nagging at her since their first encounter. "After all this time?" Alexander hesitated, his gaze drifting towards the rows of headstones, a sea of white in the fading light. I had a dream," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "About Thomas. About the ring. It felt urgent, like I needed to be here." A dream. Catherine understood the power of dreams, the way they could tap into the subconscious, revealing hidden truths, unspoken fears. She had had her own share of dreams about Lucas, vivid, heartbreaking dreams that left her aching with longing. "What did you see in your dream?" she asked, her voice soft, encouraging. Alexander closed his eyes, as if reliving the experience. "We were in Ypres," he said. "In the trenches. It was dark, raining. Shell fire everywhere. Thomas, he was holding the ring. He was trying to tell me something. But I couldn't hear him. The noise was too loud." He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting Catherine's. "Then I saw you, standing beside his grave, holding the ring. You were looking at me, asking for help." Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. The dream, it was eerily similar to the reality they were now facing. The ring, the grave, the unspoken plea for help. It was as if the past were reaching out to them, demanding to be heard. The streetlights flickered on, casting an orange glow on the deserted road. Alexander looked at her, a question in those blue depths, and a vulnerability that reached out and touched something long dormant within her own guarded heart. It was a moment of connection, of shared purpose, forged in the crucible of loss and mystery. Chapter 4. A map marked with secrets. Catherine's apartment was a small, 2-room affair on the 3rd floor of a brick building in a quiet neighborhood not far from Arlington. It was a sanctuary, a refuge from the bustling city, a place where she had retreated after Lucas's death. Books lined the walls, floor to ceiling, their familiar presence a source of comfort and solace. A small, worn Persian rug covered the wooden floor, and a single, comfortable armchair sat nestled beside a window that overlooked a small, enclosed garden. "It's modest," Catherine said, a hint of self-consciousness in her voice as she ushered Alexander inside. She hadn't had a visitor in months, her life a carefully constructed routine of work, reading, and quiet solitude. "It's peaceful," Alexander replied, his gaze taking in the room, the overflowing bookshelves, the soft glow of the lamplight. He seemed to relax slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing as he stepped further inside. Catherine gestured towards the armchair. "Please, make yourself comfortable. I'll get the letters." She disappeared into the bedroom, returning moments later with a small, wooden box. It was intricately carved, a gift from Lucas before he shipped out. Inside, nestled amongst layers of tissue paper, were his letters. Each one carefully preserved, each one a precious link to the man she had lost. She sat down on the floor opposite Alexander, placing the box between them. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, with the weight of shared grief, with the anticipation of uncovering the truth. "I haven't read them in a long time," Catherine said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's still difficult." Alexander nodded, his gaze understanding. "I know the feeling," he said softly. "There are letters I haven't been able to open, either." Catherine took a deep breath, steeling herself. She opened the box, the scent of old paper and dried lavender rising to greet her. She carefully removed the letters, arranging them in chronological order. "He didn't write often," Catherine said, her fingers tracing the familiar handwriting. "But when he did, he always tried to be optimistic, to reassure me." They began to read, Alexander poring over each letter with a quiet intensity, Catherine reading aloud the passages that mentioned Captain Ashton. There were only a few, scattered throughout the months of Lucas's service. "He says here," Catherine read, her voice catching in her throat, "Captain Ashton is a remarkable man. He cares for his men, truly cares. He wouldn't ask us to do anything he wouldn't do himself." "That was Thomas," Alexander said, a faint smile touching his lips. "He was fearless, but also compassionate. He believed in duty, in honor. But he also believed in humanity." They continued reading, searching for any mention of the ring, any clue that might explain its presence on Lucas's grave. But there was nothing. The letters were filled with the mundane details of trench life, the endless waiting, the occasional moments of terror, the longing for home. "Wait," Alexander said, his voice sharp, his finger pointing to a passage in one of the later letters. "Read that again." Catherine reread the sentence, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I saw something today that disturbed me. Something that doesn't make sense. I can't write about it here. But I need to tell someone. I'll try to explain when I see you again." "He never saw me again," Catherine whispered, the words a painful reminder of her loss. "But he saw something," Alexander said, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Something that disturbed him. Something he couldn't write about." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. "This is a map," he said, "of the area around Ypres, where we were stationed." He unfolded the map, spreading it out on the floor between them. It was old and faded, the lines hand-drawn, the details meticulously marked. Catherine recognized some of the place names, names that had become synonymous with the horrors of the war. Passchendaele, Messines, Polygon Wood. "Thomas gave me this map," Alexander said, his finger tracing a line along a small, winding road. He marked several locations, potential observation points, supply routes, that sort of thing. He pointed to a small, circled area near a ruined church. "This is where I buried him," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Catherine leaned closer, examining the map. Her eyes were drawn to another marking, a small, red X, located a short distance from the burial site. "What's this?" she asked, her finger pointing to the X. Alexander frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. I don't know," he said. "I don't remember seeing that before." He picked up the map, holding it closer to the lamplight. He examined the X more closely, his eyes widening in surprise. "There's something written here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's faint, almost invisible, but I think it's a word." He squinted, tracing the letters with his fingertip. It looks like locket, he said. Locket. The word resonated with Catherine, stirring a memory, a fleeting image. Lucas had worn a locket, hadn't he? A small, silver locket containing a picture of her. He had always kept it close, a talisman, a reminder of their love. But Catherine couldn't recall ever seeing this particular marking on any map Lucas had possessed, if he even had one. Her mind raced, and a new fear, cold and sharp, began to take root. The locket, the map, the X, they were pieces of a puzzle, scattered fragments of a truth that was slowly, agonizingly, beginning to take shape, illuminated by the soft lamplight in her quiet apartment, a world away from the muddy fields of Ypres. Chapter 5. The Lost Letters of Lieutenant Ainsworth. Lucas's locket, Catherine whispered, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. He always wore it. He said it was a good luck charm. Alexander stared at the map, his face pale. But why would Thomas mark the location of Lucas's locket on this map? And why near his burial site? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, unsettling. The connection between Lucas and Captain Ashton, already tenuous, had taken a strange and unexpected turn. The locket, a symbol of love and remembrance, had become a marker on a map, a clue in a mystery that deepened with each passing moment. Catherine rose, her legs shaky. I need to see it, she said, her voice determined. The locket. I need to see if there's anything inside. She went to her bedroom, returning with a small, velvet-lined box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded satin, lay Lucas's locket. It was silver, oval-shaped, with a delicate floral design etched on the front. She had never opened it. It had felt too personal, too sacred. A private connection between her and Lucas, a reminder of their love that she couldn't bear to disturb. But now she had to. With trembling fingers, she opened the locket. Inside, on one side, was a miniature portrait of her, taken before the war, her smile bright, her eyes filled with hope. On the other side was not another picture, as she had expected. Instead, there was a small, folded piece of paper, tucked tightly into the compartment. Catherine carefully removed the paper, unfolding it with trembling hands. It was thin and fragile, the edges frayed. On it, written in a hurried, almost illegible script, were a series of letters and numbers. A code. Alexander leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. It's a cipher, he said. A military cipher. Used to encode messages. Catherine stared at the code, her mind reeling. Lucas had been carrying a secret, a coded message hidden inside his locket. A secret that was somehow connected to Captain Ashton, to the map, to the mysterious X near his burial site. Do you know how to decipher it? Catherine asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alexander shook his head. I know some basic ciphers, he said. But this looks more complex. It might be a one-time pad, or something even more sophisticated. A one-time pad. Catherine had read about them. A highly secure form of encryption, virtually unbreakable if used correctly. If Lucas had been using a one-time pad, the key to deciphering the message would be lost. We need to find someone who can help us, Catherine said, her voice filled with a growing sense of urgency. Someone who understands these things. Alexander nodded. I know someone, he said. A former colleague. He worked in intelligence during the war. He's discreet. And he owes me a favor. He hesitated, his gaze meeting Catherine's. But we need to be careful, he said. This could be dangerous. We don't know who else might be involved, or what they might be capable of. Catherine met his gaze, her own fear mirrored in his eyes. But beneath the fear, there was also a determination, a resolve that had been growing stronger with each revelation. She had come too far to turn back now. She needed to know the truth, no matter the cost. I understand, she said, her voice firm. But we have to do this. For Lucas. For Captain Ashton. And for ourselves. Alexander reached into his coat pocket and, to Catherine's shock, produced a small, leather-bound notebook. It was worn and faded, the pages filled with a neat, precise handwriting that she immediately recognized, even before Alexander spoke. These, he began, his voice thick with a sudden rush of emotion, are letters. Letters Thomas wrote, but never sent. I found them among his belongings after Ypres. I've never been able to bring myself to read them, not fully. Until now. He opened the notebook, carefully turning the fragile pages. Catherine leaned closer, drawn in by the intimacy of the moment, by the raw emotion emanating from Alexander. Here were the unspoken words of a dead man, a man whose life had become inextricably linked with hers, a man whose secrets might hold the key to unlocking the mystery of Lucas's death and the strange ring. The first letter was dated months before the final, fatal battle. The words painted a vivid picture of life in the trenches, the camaraderie, the fear, the constant longing for home. But there, woven within the descriptions, were hints of something more, something unsettling. A growing unease, a sense of being watched, of a conspiracy brewing in the shadows. The apartment was silent, save for the gentle rustling of pages, holding the secrets of the past, the echoes of a war that refused to stay silent. Chapter 6. Among the Ruins of Remembrance. Alexander began to read aloud, his voice low and resonant, filling the quiet apartment with the words of the dead. Captain Ashton's letters were a mixture of personal reflections, observations on the war, and increasingly, veiled references to a clandestine operation, something he referred to only as Project Nightingale. The rumors persist, Alexander read from one entry, of a leak within our ranks. Someone is passing information to the enemy. I fear the consequences could be catastrophic. I've been tasked with investigating, but I'm walking a tightrope. Trust is a rare commodity these days. Catherine listened intently, her mind racing. A leak? Espionage? It was a world she had only read about in books, a world of shadows and deception, of hidden agendas and deadly consequences. And now, it seemed, Lucas had been caught in the middle of it. I've met a young sergeant, Alexander read from another letter. Lucas Beckett. He's sharp, resourceful. I've confided in him. To a degree. He's agreed to help me gather information. He doesn't know the full extent of the operation, of course. But he's trustworthy. I believe that. Catherine's heart ached. Lucas. Her brave, loyal Lucas. He had been drawn into a dangerous game, a world of secrets and lies, without even knowing the full stakes. He had been used, manipulated, his inherent goodness exploited for a cause he barely understood. The ring, Alexander read, his voice catching in his throat, is more than just a memento. It's a key, a symbol. It identifies the members of Project Nightingale. There are only a few of us. We each have one. It's our way of recognizing each other, of ensuring we can trust one another. The ring that had started it all. It wasn't just a promise between two friends. It was a badge of membership, a mark of belonging to a secret society, a clandestine group operating within the chaos of the war. I've discovered something disturbing, Alexander read from a later entry, the last one before Captain Ashton's death, something that could expose Project Nightingale and endanger us all. I've encoded the information, hidden it. I need to get it to the right person. But I don't know who to trust anymore. Except perhaps Beckett. The coded message in the locket. It all made sense now. Captain Ashton had entrusted Lucas with the information, with the secret that could expose the leak, that could save lives. But Lucas had never had the chance to deliver it. He had died, taking the secret with him, or so it had seemed. The X on the map, Catherine said, her voice trembling. The locket. It must be where Captain Ashton hid something. Something related to Project Nightingale. Alexander nodded, his eyes filled with a grim determination. We need to go there, he said. To Ypres. To the location marked on the map. The thought of traveling to Ypres, to the place where Lucas had died, where Captain Ashton had been buried, filled Catherine with a mixture of dread and anticipation. It was a journey into the heart of darkness, a pilgrimage to a place of unimaginable loss. But it was also a journey of discovery, a quest for the truth. It won't be easy, Alexander said, his gaze meeting Catherine's. The area is still devastated. And there might be others, looking for the same thing. Catherine met his gaze, her own fear mirrored in his eyes. But beneath the fear, there was also a resolve, a determination that had been forged in the crucible of loss and mystery. "I know," she said, her voice firm, "but we have to try. We owe it to them. To Lucas. To Captain Ashton. To all those who never came home." Alexander nodded, his hand reaching out to cover hers, a silent gesture of support, of shared purpose. The decision was made. They would travel to Ypres, to the ruins of remembrance, to the place where the past refused to stay buried. They would face the dangers, the uncertainties, the ghosts of the war, together. They would uncover the truth, whatever the cost. The journey would be perilous, the destination unknown, but the need to know, to understand, burned brighter than any fear. The quiet apartment, with its books and memories, felt a world away from the shattered landscape that awaited them, but it was here, in this sanctuary of peace, that the decision was made, a decision that would change their lives forever. Chapter 7. The Spy's Confession and the Nurse's Dilemma. Preparations for the journey to Ypres were made swiftly, quietly. Alexander arranged for passage on a ship crossing the channel, securing the necessary documents, the false identities that would allow them to move undetected. Catherine packed a small bag, her movements deliberate, her mind focused on the task at hand. She included Lucas's letters, the map, the locket, and a small, worn photograph of him, a tangible reminder of the man she had loved, the man she was determined to honor. As they waited for the day of their departure, Alexander contacted his former colleague, the intelligence officer he had mentioned. They met in a discreet cafe, a dimly lit establishment frequented by ex-servicemen, a place where secrets could be exchanged without fear of eavesdropping. The man, introduced only as Mr. Davies, was middle-aged, with a sharp, intelligent gaze and a demeanor that suggested a life spent navigating the murky world of espionage. He listened intently as Alexander explained the situation, the ring, the map, the coded message in the locket. "Project Nightingale," Mr. Davies said, his voice low and thoughtful. "I've heard whispers of it. A highly classified operation. Very few knew the details. It was shut down. After Ypres." "Shut down?" Catherine asked, her voice filled with surprise. "But why?" Mr. Davies hesitated, his gaze meeting hers. "There were rumors of a betrayal, a double agent. The operation was compromised. Many good men were lost. A double agent." The word sent a chill down Catherine's spine. It confirmed Captain Ashton's suspicions, the leak he had been investigating. But who was the double agent? And what had happened to them? "We believe Captain Ashton had discovered the identity of the double agent," Alexander said. "He encoded the information, hid it in a locket that belonged to Sergeant Beckett." Mr. Davies examined the locket, his eyes narrowing. "This cipher," he said. "It's complex, but I think I can crack it. It will take time." "We don't have much time," Catherine said, her voice urgent. "We're leaving for Ypres soon. We need to know what's in that message." Mr. Davies nodded. "I'll do what I can," he said. "But I need you to be careful. If Project Nightingale was compromised, there might be others who are still looking for that information. Others who would silence you permanently." His warning hung in the air, a stark reminder of the dangers they faced. They were stepping into a world of shadows and deception, a world where trust was a rare commodity, where betrayal lurked around every corner. As they left the cafe, Catherine's thoughts turned to another aspect of the war, another group of unsung heroes, the nurses. She had volunteered at a local hospital during the war, tending to the wounded, witnessing the devastating consequences of the conflict firsthand. She had seen the bravery, the resilience, the compassion of the nurses, the women who had faced the horrors of war with unwavering courage. She remembered one nurse in particular, a woman named Eleanor Davies, no relation to the intelligence officer who had served in France. Eleanor had been a close friend, a confidant. They had shared their hopes, their fears, their dreams, in the quiet moments between the endless flow of casualties. Catherine hadn't seen Eleanor since the war ended. She knew she had returned to England, but they had lost touch, their lives diverging in the aftermath of the conflict. An idea sparked in Catherine's mind. Eleanor. She had served in Ypres. She might know something. She might have known Captain Ashton. Or Lucas. She might have witnessed something. Alexander, Catherine said, her voice filled with a sudden urgency. I need to find someone. A nurse. A friend of mine. She served in Ypres. Alexander looked at her, his brow furrowed in concern. Another contact? He asked. Is that wise? I trust her, Catherine said, her voice firm. She's one of the good ones. She might have information. She might be able to help us. Alexander hesitated, his gaze searching hers. He saw the determination in her eyes, the unwavering resolve that had been growing stronger with each passing day. He knew he couldn't dissuade her. All right, he said. But we'll do it together. We stick together. No matter what. Catherine nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. They were taking another risk, adding another layer to their already complex and dangerous mission. But she knew it was a risk worth taking. Eleanor, with her knowledge of the battlefield, with her compassion, with her unwavering loyalty, might be the key to unlocking the final piece of the puzzle. The cafe, with its hushed conversations and lingering shadows, faded into the background as they set off to find Eleanor, another thread in the tapestry of war, love, and betrayal that they were slowly, painstakingly unraveling. Chapter 8. Beneath the Parisian moonlight. Finding Eleanor proved to be more challenging than Catherine had anticipated. The war had scattered people across the country, across the world. Addresses had changed, lives had been irrevocably altered. But Catherine was persistent, using her librarian skills to track down leads, to follow the faint trail of Eleanor's post-war life. Finally, after days of searching, she found her. Eleanor was living in Paris, working at a small clinic that catered to injured veterans. It was a surprising discovery, a twist of fate that Catherine couldn't quite explain. But it also felt right. Eleanor, always drawn to healing, always seeking to alleviate suffering, had found a new purpose in the aftermath of the war. Alexander booked them passage on the next train to Paris, their journey to Ypres temporarily diverted. The City of Lights, still recovering from the ravages of war, greeted them with a mixture of beauty and melancholy. The grand boulevards, the elegant architecture, the vibrant cafes, it was all a stark contrast to the desolate landscapes they would soon be facing. They found Eleanor's clinic in a quiet side street, a modest building with a small, discreet sign above the door. Catherine hesitated before entering, her heart pounding against her ribs. It had been years since she had last seen Eleanor, years filled with loss, with grief, with the slow, painful process of rebuilding her life. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She pushed open the door, stepping inside. The clinic was small but clean and well lit. A few patients sat waiting in the reception area, their faces etched with the scars of war. A young woman, dressed in a nurse's uniform, sat behind a desk, her gaze welcoming. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft, her French accent charming. "I'm looking for Eleanor Davies," Catherine said, her voice trembling slightly. I'm a friend of hers." "From England?" The young woman's eyes widened slightly. "Eleanor?"
she said.
She's in the back. With a patient. But I'll tell her you're here." She disappeared through a door at the back of the room, returning moments later, her face beaming.
"She'll see you now," she said.
"Go right through." Catherine, followed by Alexander, walked through the door, her heart pounding with anticipation. The room was small and sparsely furnished, a single examination table dominating the space. Eleanor stood beside the table, her back to the door, her attention focused on a young man sitting on the edge of the table, his arm bandaged. "Eleanor?" Catherine said, her voice barely a whisper. Eleanor turned, her eyes widening in surprise, then recognition. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile that reached all the way to her eyes, a smile that erased the years, the distance, the pain. "Catherine?" she said, her voice filled with disbelief. "Is it really you?" They rushed towards each other, embracing in a hug that spoke volumes, a hug that conveyed the shared experiences, the unspoken bonds, the enduring friendship that had survived the war. "It's so good to see you," Catherine said, her voice choked with emotion. "And you," Eleanor replied, her eyes sparkling with tears. What brings you to Paris?" Catherine hesitated, glancing at Alexander, who stood quietly by the door, observing the reunion. She had decided to be cautious, to reveal only what was necessary. "It's a long story," Catherine said, "but it's about Lucas." Eleanor's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "Lucas?"
she said.
"What about him?" Catherine explained briefly about the ring, the map, the coded message. She didn't mention Project Nightingale or the double agent. She focused on the personal connection, the mystery surrounding Lucas's involvement with Captain Ashton. Eleanor listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Captain Ashton," she said, her voice thoughtful. "I remember him. He was a good man. A kind man. He visited the hospital often, checking on his men." Did you know Lucas?" Catherine asked, her voice hopeful. Eleanor hesitated. "I saw him," she said. "A few times. He was brought in with injuries, but I didn't treat him personally." She paused, her gaze meeting Catherine's. "There was something strange about his case," she said. "Something that bothered me at the time." She looked about the room and suggested they all go for a walk, citing the need for fresh air and the beauty of the Parisian evening. Once outside, under the soft glow of the Parisian moonlight, with gas lamps casting long shadows along the Seine, Eleanor seemed more at ease, the city itself a cloak of anonymity. "There were whispers, you see," Eleanor stated, "that Sergeant Beckett's injuries weren't entirely sustained in battle." Her voice trailed off, as if she was searching the reflections in the dark water for the right words, or perhaps the courage to continue. The city, with its hidden courtyards and whispered secrets, seemed to mirror the complexities of the story unfolding, a story that was becoming less about a lost locket and more about a hidden truth, a truth that someone, somewhere, was desperate to keep buried. Chapter 9. A Dance of Deception and Desire. Catherine's heart quickened its pace. "What do you mean, Eleanor? What whispers?" The Parisian moonlight seemed to accentuate the seriousness in Eleanor's eyes, the subtle lines of worry etched around them. Eleanor glanced at Alexander, a silent question in her gaze. Catherine nodded, reassuring her. "You can trust him, Eleanor. He's helping me." Eleanor took a deep breath, the cool night air seeming to steal her resolve. "There were rumors," she said, her voice low, almost conspiratorial, that Sergeant Beckett had been interrogated before he was brought to the hospital, that his injuries were inflicted
Deliberately.
Interrogated. Inflicted. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Lucas. Her gentle, loving Lucas. Subjected to torture? By whom?
And why?
But who would do such a thing? Catherine asked, her voice trembling. And for what reason? Eleanor shook her head.
"I don't know," she said.
It was all very hush-hush. The officers were tight-lipped, but there was talk of a security breach, of a leak, of someone passing information to the enemy. The leak. Project Nightingale. It all came back to that, to the clandestine operation, to the double agent that Captain Ashton had been hunting. Lucas had been caught in the crossfire, a pawn in a deadly game of espionage. Did you see him?" Catherine asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Lucas. After the interrogation?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. "I saw him briefly," she said.
"He was in a bad way."
"He was delirious. He kept mumbling something about a map and a locket. The map. The locket." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, forming a disturbing picture. Lucas had known something that someone wanted to keep secret. He had been tortured for information for the location of the coded message. "We need to find out who interrogated him," Alexander said, his voice grim. "Who gave the orders?" Eleanor hesitated. "There was one officer," she said, her voice hesitant. "He was in charge of the investigation. He was ruthless, feared by everyone. His name was Major Thorn. Major Thorn. The name sent a shiver down Catherine's spine. A ruthless officer. Feared by everyone. He was the likely culprit, the man who had ordered Lucas's torture, the man who was responsible for his suffering. Do you know where to find him? Alexander asked. Eleanor shook her head.
I don't, she said.
He disappeared. After Ypres. No one knows what happened to him. Disappeared. Just like Captain Ashton. Just like the double agent. It was as if a shadow had fallen over Project Nightingale, erasing all traces of its existence, silencing those who knew its secrets. The conversation stalled, the weight of the revelations pressing down on them. The beauty of the Parisian night, the gentle lapping of the Seine, the soft glow of the gaslights, it all seemed a cruel mockery of the darkness they were uncovering. As they walked back towards the clinic, a different kind of tension began to build between Catherine and Alexander. The shared danger, the shared grief, the shared purpose that had forged a bond between them, a connection that went beyond mere friendship. Catherine found herself stealing glances at Alexander, noticing the way the moonlight illuminated his strong features, the way his blue eyes held a mixture of sadness and determination, the way he carried himself with a quiet dignity that spoke of a strength forged in the crucible of war. She realized, with a start, that she was attracted to him. It was a surprising realization, a feeling she hadn't expected, a feeling she had thought long dead, buried with Lucas. But it was there, undeniable, a spark of something new, something unexpected, amidst the ashes of the past. It was a feeling that both thrilled and terrified her. Alexander, too, seemed to be affected. He caught her gaze, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. A faint smile touched his lips, a smile that sent a shiver of warmth through her. There was an unspoken question in that exchange, and an equally cautious willingness to explore. The night air seemed charged with a different kind of electricity, and in that moment of shared vulnerability, beneath the cloak of a Parisian moon, a dance of deception and desire, carefully, tentatively, began. Chapter 10. The telegram that tore them apart. Back at Catherine's small rented room, the silence was thick with unspoken emotions. The revelations about Lucas, the danger surrounding Major Thorn, and the undeniable spark between her and Alexander, it was all too much to process. Catherine busied herself making tea, her movements mechanical, her mind racing. She needed to ground herself, to find a moment of calm amidst the storm. Alexander stood by the window, looking out at the Parisian night, his silhouette framed by the soft glow of the streetlights. He seemed lost in thought, his shoulders slumped, his usual stoic demeanor replaced by a visible weariness. He was so young, Catherine said, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the silence. She was talking about Lucas, about the boy she had married, the man she had lost. Alexander turned, his blue eyes filled with a shared grief. They all were, he said softly. Too young. Too many lives cut short. Catherine placed a cup of tea in front of him, their fingers brushing. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a reminder of the undeniable attraction that simmered beneath the surface. Thank you, Alexander said, his voice husky. He took a sip of the tea, his gaze meeting hers. Eleanor, she was a good friend, Catherine said, changing the subject, needing to steer the conversation away from the dangerous territory of their growing feelings. We helped each other. Through the worst of it. She seems strong, Alexander said. Resilient. She is, Catherine agreed. The war, it changed us all. But Eleanor, she found a way to keep going. To keep healing. A silence fell between them. A comfortable silence. A silence filled with shared understanding. They were two survivors, two souls scarred by the war, finding solace in each other's presence. Catherine found herself studying Alexander, noticing the lines etched around his eyes, the hint of gray at his temples, the subtle stiffness in his posture that spoke of his military past. He was a man of strength, of resilience, but also of vulnerability. A man who had seen too much, who had lost too much, but who still carried a spark of hope, a flicker of kindness in his eyes. What will you do? Alexander asked, his voice breaking the silence. After all this is over? After we find the truth? Catherine hesitated. She hadn't thought that far ahead. Her life had been consumed by the search for answers, by the need to unravel the mystery surrounding Lucas's death. She hadn't allowed herself to think about the future, about what might come next. I don't know, she said honestly. I haven't thought about it. You could stay in Paris, Alexander suggested, his voice tentative. Start a new life. A new beginning. The idea was tempting. Paris. A city of beauty, of art, of culture. A city of new beginnings. A city where she could escape the ghosts of the past, where she could forge a new identity, a new life. But could she? Could she leave behind the memories of Lucas, the life they had shared, the love they had lost? Could she truly start anew, without ever fully resolving the past? I don't know if I can, she said, her voice trembling. There's too much unfinished business. Too many unanswered questions. Alexander nodded, understanding. He knew the pull of the past, the weight of unfinished business. He carried his own burdens, his own unanswered questions. Suddenly, a sharp rap on the door startled them both. Alexander instinctively moved in front of Catherine, shielding her, his hand reaching inside his coat, as if for a weapon. Who is it? He called out, his voice firm, authoritative. It's me, a voice replied. Davies. Mr. Davies. Alexander relaxed slightly, recognizing the voice of his intelligence contact. He opened the door, revealing Mr. Davies standing in the hallway, his face grim. I have news, Mr. Davies said, his voice urgent. About the cipher. And about Major Thorne. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He held out a small, folded piece of paper. I've deciphered the message, he said. It was a one-time pad, as we suspected. But I managed to crack it. The key was a line from a poem that Captain Ashton was fond of. He handed the paper to Catherine. She unfolded it, her hands trembling. The message was short, stark, devastating. Thorne is the traitor. He's working with the Germans. He's selling our secrets. Stop him. Catherine gasped, her eyes widening in horror. Major Thorne, the ruthless officer, the man who had ordered Lucas's torture. He was the double agent. He was the one responsible for the betrayal, for the deaths of so many good men. But that's not all, Mr. Davies said, his voice grave. I've been doing some digging. About Major Thorne. He didn't disappear. After Ypres, he was recruited by a foreign power. He's still alive. And he's in Paris. A sharp intake of breath. Alexander felt it, rather than heard it, the almost imperceptible sound betraying Catherine's shock more profoundly than any scream. The telegram, a pale, innocent-looking square of paper, sat accusingly on the small table beside the decoded message, its official government seal a cruel mockery of the personal devastation it contained. It was a telegram Alexander had intercepted, using every contact, every favor owed, to get to before it reached Catherine, hoping, foolishly, that he could somehow shield her from this final, brutal blow. It announced, with cold, bureaucratic efficiency, the official identification of Lucas Beckett's remains, recovered from a recently discovered mass grave near Ypres. The details that followed, the clinical description of identifying markers, were a knife twisting in a wound that had never truly healed. Chapter 11. Trenches of Truth and Lies. The air in the room crackled with tension. Major Thorne.
Alive.
In Paris. The man who had betrayed his country, who had tortured Lucas, who was responsible for countless deaths, he was within reach. Catherine felt a surge of anger, a raw, visceral rage that consumed her. She wanted justice. She wanted revenge. She wanted Thorne to pay for his crimes. We have to find him, she said, her voice trembling with fury. We have to stop him. Alexander nodded, his blue eyes hardened with determination. We will, he said. But we need to be careful. He's dangerous. He's connected. He won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who gets in his way. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, his expression grave. I've managed to acquire some information, he said, about Thorne's activities. He's working with a shadowy organization. a group of former intelligence officers, mercenaries, spies. They're involved in various illicit activities. Arms dealing, smuggling, political assassination. He's still selling secrets, Catherine said, her voice bitter. Still betraying his country. It seems so, Mr. Davies agreed. But his primary focus now is profit. He's become a very wealthy man. We need to find out where he is, Alexander said. Where he operates. Who he's working with. Mr. Davies nodded. I have a contact, he said. Someone who moves in those circles. Someone who might have information about Thorn. But it will be risky. Meeting with him. We're running out of time, Catherine said. The telegram, still clutched in Alexander's hand, felt like a burning coal. She knew what it contained, the official confirmation of Lucas's death, a finality she had been desperately trying to avoid. We have to take the risk, Alexander said, his gaze meeting Catherine's. He saw the pain in her eyes, the grief that threatened to overwhelm her. But he also saw the strength, the resilience, the unwavering determination that had brought them this far. They agreed to meet Mr. Davies' contact the following evening in a secluded bar in a less reputable part of Paris. It was a dangerous game they were playing, a game of cat and mouse with a ruthless enemy. But they were determined to see it through, to uncover the truth, to bring Thorn to justice. The next day was spent in a state of anxious anticipation. Catherine couldn't shake the image of Lucas, of his suffering, of his final moments. The telegram, with its cold, official confirmation of his death, had reopened the wounds, had brought back the pain, the grief, the sense of loss that she had tried so hard to suppress. Alexander, sensing her distress, tried to comfort her. He shared his own memories of Lucas, of his bravery, of his loyalty, of his unwavering spirit. He spoke of the camaraderie they had shared, the bonds that had been forged in the crucible of war. He was a good man, Catherine, Alexander said, his voice soft. A true friend. He would want you to be strong, to keep going. Catherine nodded, her eyes filled with tears. She knew he was right. Lucas wouldn't want her to give up. He would want her to fight for justice, to honor his memory. As evening approached, they prepared for the meeting with Mr. Davies' contact. Catherine changed into a simple, dark dress, her movements deliberate, her mind focused on the task ahead. She knew they were walking into a dangerous situation, a world of shadows and deception, where trust was a rare commodity. Alexander, too, prepared himself. He checked his weapon, a small, concealed pistol, a grim reminder of the dangers they faced. He had hoped to leave that life behind, the life of violence, of espionage, of constant threat. But he knew he couldn't. Not yet. Not until Thorn was brought to justice. They met Mr. Davies outside the bar, a dimly lit establishment with a faded sign and a clientele that looked unsavory. The air was thick with a smell of smoke, of alcohol, of desperation. Be careful, Mr. Davies warned them. My contact, he's unpredictable. He's a survivor. He'll do whatever it takes to protect himself. They entered the bar, their senses on high alert. The room was crowded, smoky, the noise level-deafening. They found a secluded booth in the back, away from prying eyes. A man sat waiting for them, his face obscured by the shadows. He was middle-aged, with a hard, cynical gaze and a demeanor that suggested a life lived on the edge. You're Davies' friends, he said, his voice raspy, his accent difficult to place. We are, Alexander replied. We're looking for information. About Major Thorn. The man's eyes narrowed. Thorn, he said, his voice laced with a mixture of fear and disdain. He's bad news. Dangerous. You don't want to cross him. We know the risks, Catherine said, her voice firm. But we need to find him.
We need to stop him.
The man hesitated, his gaze assessing them. He seemed to be weighing the risks, calculating the potential benefits. Information costs money, he said finally. Alexander placed a small stack of bills on the table.
This is just a down payment, he said.
There's more. If you can help us. The trench coats they both wore, damp from a sudden Parisian downpour, seemed to symbolize the layers of secrecy and danger that surrounded them, mirroring the trenches of truth and lies they were navigating. Chapter 12. The hospital ward's hidden heartbreak. The man's eyes flickered towards the money, then back to Alexander. He reached out, his hand hovering over the bills, but he didn't take them. Not yet. Thorn, he's careful, he said, his voice low and cautious. He doesn't trust anyone.
He moves around a lot.
He has many safe houses. We need a location, Alexander said. A name. Anything that can help us find him. The man hesitated again, his gaze darting around the room as if checking for eavesdroppers. The bar was noisy, crowded, but he seemed to sense a threat, a presence that made him uneasy. There's a place, he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. An old hospital. Abandoned. Near the outskirts of the city. He uses it sometimes. For meetings. An abandoned hospital. The irony was bitter. A place of healing, of compassion, transformed into a den of shadows, of secrets, of betrayal. It was a fitting location for Thorn, a man who had corrupted everything he touched. When? Catherine asked, her voice urgent. When will he be there? The man shook his head.
I don't know, he said.
It's unpredictable. He comes and goes. Without warning. But you must have some idea, Alexander pressed. A pattern. A routine. The man hesitated again, his gaze meeting Alexander's. He seemed to be struggling with a decision, weighing the risks, the potential consequences. There's a shipment, he said finally, his voice low and hesitant.
Coming in.
Tomorrow night. From the east. Arms. Munitions. Thorn, he'll be there. To oversee it. A shipment. Arms and munitions. Thorn was still dealing in death, still profiting from the misery of others. It was a chance, an opportunity to catch him, to expose him, to bring him to justice. Where? Alexander asked, his voice sharp. Where is the shipment arriving? The man looked at the money on the table, then back at Alexander. He reached out, his hand closing over the bills.
The old hospital, he said.
The East Wing. Midnight. He stood up, his movements quick, abrupt.
That's all I know, he said. Don't contact me again. And be careful.
Thorn, he has eyes everywhere. He disappeared into the crowd, melting away into the shadows, leaving Alexander and Catherine alone with the information, with the dangerous knowledge that could lead them to Thorn. They left the bar, stepping out into the cool night air. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting, anticipating. The confrontation was coming, the inevitable clash between good and evil, between truth and lies. We need a plan, Catherine said, her voice firm. We can't just walk in there. Blindly. Alexander nodded. We need to scout the location, he said. Assess the security. Find a way in. And a way out. They spent the rest of the night planning, strategizing, preparing for the confrontation with Thorn. They knew the risks, the dangers, the potential consequences. But they were determined to see it through, to bring justice to Lucas, to Captain Ashton, to all those who had been betrayed by Thorn. The abandoned hospital loomed before them, a dark, imposing silhouette against the night sky. It was a place of forgotten sorrows, of lingering pain, of whispered secrets. The East Wing, their target, was shrouded in darkness, the windows boarded up, the doors secured. It was a fortress, a stronghold, a place where Thorn felt safe, where he conducted his illicit activities, where he hid from the consequences of his crimes. But as Catherine looked up to a single, flickering light in a window on the third floor that once housed the nurses' quarters, a cruel twist of fate, she felt a flicker of something other than fear. Resolve. The hospital ward, with its hidden heartbreak, might just hold the key to exposing Thorn's lies and finally bringing him to justice. Chapter 13. Across the no-man's land of love. They scouted the hospital during the day, posing as curious tourists, observing the surrounding area, identifying potential entry points, escape routes. The building was derelict, crumbling, a testament to the ravages of war, but it was also heavily guarded. Men with hard faces and watchful eyes patrolled the perimeter, their presence a clear warning to anyone who dared to approach. Alexander, using his military experience, identified a weak point in the security, a section of the perimeter wall that was partially collapsed, hidden by overgrown vegetation. It was a risky approach, but it was their best option. As they planned, Catherine found herself increasingly drawn to Alexander. His strength, his competence, his unwavering determination, it was a comfort, a reassurance, a stark contrast to the chaos and uncertainty that surrounded them. She saw the pain in his eyes, the grief he carried, the burden of his past. But she also saw the kindness, the compassion, the flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished. She realized that her feelings for him had deepened, had evolved beyond mere attraction. She was falling in love with him. It was a terrifying realization, a feeling that seemed almost inappropriate, given the circumstances, given the ghost of Lucas that still lingered between them. But it was also undeniable. A spark of life, of hope, amidst the ashes of the past. A testament to the resilience of the human heart, its ability to find love, even in the darkest of times. Alexander, too, seemed to be struggling with his feelings. He caught her gaze, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. He touched her hand, a fleeting gesture, but one that sent a shiver of warmth through her. He spoke to her with a tenderness, a concern, that went beyond mere friendship. They were walking a tightrope, a delicate balance between the mission, the danger, the grief, and the burgeoning feelings that threatened to overwhelm them. They were crossing a no-man's land of love, a treacherous terrain filled with hidden dangers, with unspoken desires, with the ghosts of the past. As evening approached, they prepared for the final confrontation. Catherine insisted on accompanying Alexander, despite his protests. She wouldn't be left behind. She wouldn't be sidelined. She was a part of this. She had a right to be there to see justice done. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice firm, meeting his gaze. "I've faced fear before. I've lost everything. I have nothing left to lose." Alexander saw the determination in her eyes, the unwavering resolve that had been forged in the crucible of loss and grief. He knew he couldn't dissuade her. He also knew that he didn't want to. He needed her by his side, her strength, her courage, her unwavering belief in justice. They returned to the hospital under the cover of darkness, approaching the collapsed section of the wall with stealth and caution. The air was thick with tension, with anticipation, with the ever-present threat of danger. They slipped through the gap in the wall, moving silently through the overgrown vegetation, their senses on high alert. The hospital loomed before them, a dark, imposing silhouette against the night sky. They made their way towards the east wing, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The building was eerily silent, the only sound the distant hum of the city, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. They reached the entrance to the east wing, a heavy, wooden door, secured with a rusty padlock. Alexander produced a set of lock picks, his movements deft, practiced. He worked quickly, silently, the tumblers clicking softly in the darkness. The lock sprung open. They slipped inside, closing the door behind them. They were in. The interior of the hospital was dark, desolate, the air thick with the smell of dust, of decay, of forgotten pain. Moonlight filtered through the boarded-up windows, casting eerie shadows across the crumbling walls. They moved slowly, cautiously, their weapons drawn, their senses on high alert. They could hear voices, muffled, indistinct, coming from further inside the building. Thorn was here. They were close. The corridor stretched before them, long and dark, lined with closed doors, each one a potential hiding place, a potential threat. They were walking into a trap, a labyrinth of shadows and secrets. The no-man's land they had been traversing emotionally seemed to manifest physically, a dangerous, unpredictable space where one wrong step could lead to disaster. Yet, hand in hand, they moved forward, their shared purpose a fragile shield against the darkness. Chapter 14. The Price of Honor and the Cost of Survival. The voices grew louder as they approached a large, double door at the end of the corridor. A faint light seeped from beneath the door, casting a flickering glow on the dusty floor. Alexander signaled Catherine to stay back. He pressed his ear against the door, listening. He could hear Thorn's voice, sharp, authoritative, giving orders. He could hear the sounds of movement, of crates being opened, of weapons being handled. This was it. The moment of truth. Alexander took a deep breath, steeling himself. He nodded to Catherine, his eyes conveying a mixture of warning and reassurance. He pushed open the doors, stepping inside. The room was large, dimly lit by a few flickering lanterns. Crates were stacked against the walls, filled with weapons, munitions. Several men, armed and dangerous, stood around a table, their attention focused on Thorn, who stood at the head of the table, a map spread out before him. Thorn looked up, his eyes narrowing as he saw Alexander and Catherine. A flicker of surprise, then recognition, crossed his face. "Ainsworth," he said, his voice cold, laced with a hint of amusement.
"I should have known you'd be involved."
"You always were persistent." "Thorn," Alexander replied, his voice equally cold. "It's over. We know everything." Thorn smiled, a cruel, cynical smile.
"Do you?" he said.
"I doubt that very much." He gestured to his men. "Take them," he said. The men moved towards Alexander and Catherine, their weapons raised. A tense standoff ensued, the air thick with the threat of violence. "You betrayed your country," Catherine said, her voice trembling with anger. "You tortured Lucas. You murdered innocent men." Thorn's smile widened. "War is a dirty business, my dear," he said. "There are no innocents. Only winners and losers." "You're a traitor," Alexander said. "A coward. You deserve to rot in prison." Thorn laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Prison?" he said. "I think not. I have friends. In high places. They won't let that happen." He reached inside his coat, pulling out a pistol. He pointed it at Alexander, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Goodbye, Ainsworth," he said. Suddenly, a shot rang out. But it wasn't Thorn's. One of Thorn's men, standing near the crates, slumped to the ground, a bullet hole in his chest. Chaos erupted. The other men turned, firing their weapons, unsure of who had fired the shot. Alexander and Catherine used the confusion to their advantage. They dove for cover, taking shelter behind a stack of crates. Another shot rang out, and another of Thorn's men fell. Someone was helping them. But who? Alexander peered out from behind the crates. He saw a figure, silhouetted in the doorway, holding a rifle. The figure was tall, lean, familiar. It was Mr. Davies. He had followed them. He had come to help. Mr. Davies fired again, and another of Thorn's men went down. The remaining men, realizing they were outgunned, scattered, fleeing the room. Thorn, seeing his advantage disappear, turned and ran, disappearing through a door at the back of the room. Alexander and Catherine emerged from behind the crates, their weapons still drawn. Mr. Davies approached them, his face grim. "Are you all right?" he asked. "We're fine," Alexander replied. "Thanks to you." "He got away," Catherine said, her voice filled with frustration.
"Thorn."
"He escaped." "He won't get far," Mr. Davies said. "I've alerted the authorities. They're on their way." The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, growing closer. The police were coming. But Catherine knew that it wasn't over.
Thorn was still out there.
He was still a threat. And she wouldn't rest until he was brought to justice. The price of honor, she realized, was vigilance. And the cost of survival, in this world of shadows and lies, was the willingness to fight, even when all seemed lost. The flickering lanterns cast dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the faces of the fallen, a stark reminder of the brutal reality of their situation. Chapter 15. Shadows of Betrayal in the Safe House. The arrival of the police brought a temporary sense of order, but also a wave of complications. The abandoned hospital was swarming with officers, securing the scene, gathering evidence, questioning witnesses. Alexander and Catherine were detained, questioned, their story scrutinized. Their connection to Mr. Davies, their knowledge of Project Nightingale, their presence at the scene, it all raised suspicions. Mr. Davies, using his contacts within the intelligence community, managed to smooth things over, to vouch for them, to secure their release. But it was a close call. They were walking a fine line, caught between the law and their own pursuit of justice. They retreated to a safe house, a small, discreet apartment that Mr. Davies had arranged for them. It was a temporary refuge, a place to regroup, to plan their next move. Thorn was still at large, and they knew he wouldn't give up easily. He was resourceful, connected, and he had a lot to lose. Catherine felt a growing sense of frustration, of helplessness. They had come so close, yet Thorn had slipped through their fingers. She paced the small apartment, her mind racing, her anger simmering. "We need to find him," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "Before he disappears again. Before he hurts anyone else." Alexander, sitting at a small table, cleaning his pistol, nodded.
"We will," he said.
"But we need to be smart. We can't just rush in blindly. We need a plan." Mr. Davies, who had accompanied them to the safe house, leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. "Thorn is predictable," he said. "In a way. He's driven by greed, by power. He'll seek out his allies, his contacts, the people who can help him escape, who can provide him with resources. We need to find out who those people are," Catherine said.
"Who he's working with.
"Who's protecting him?" Mr. Davies nodded. "I have some feelers out," he said. "My contacts are discreetly inquiring. It will take time."
Time.
It was a luxury they didn't have. Thorn could be anywhere, planning his next move, preparing to disappear forever. Catherine stopped pacing, her gaze settling on Alexander. She saw the weariness in his eyes, the strain of the past few days, the burden of responsibility he carried. She also saw the unwavering determination, the flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished. She walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked up at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, gratitude, concern, and something else. Something deeper, something that mirrored her own feelings. "I'm tired," he admitted, "but I'm not giving up."
"Not yet."
He covered her hand with his, their fingers intertwining. The contact sent a shiver of warmth through her, a reminder of the undeniable connection that had grown between them amidst the danger, the grief, the uncertainty. "We'll do this together," she said, her voice firm. "We'll find him. We'll bring him to justice." He squeezed her hand, his gaze holding hers. "Together," he echoed. A silence fell between them, a comfortable silence, a silence filled with unspoken promises, with shared hopes, with the fragile beginnings of a love that had blossomed in the shadows of betrayal. Suddenly, a knock on the door startled them. Mr. Davies moved towards the door, his hand reaching inside his coat, as if for a weapon. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice cautious. A voice replied, muffled, indistinct. Mr. Davies exchanged a glance with Alexander, then cautiously opened the door. A woman stood in the hallway, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. It was Eleanor. "Eleanor?" Catherine said, her voice filled with surprise. What are you doing here?" Eleanor rushed inside, closing the door behind her. She was trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They took him," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "They took my patient. The young man. From the clinic." "Who took him?" Alexander asked, his voice sharp. "Who are they?" "Thorn's men," Eleanor replied. "They came, they barged in. They threatened me. They said they were looking for information." "About you?" "About Project Nightingale." Catherine felt a chill run down her spine.
"Thorn."
He was retaliating. He was using Eleanor, using her patient, to get to them. What did they want? Mr. Davies asked. They wanted to know everything, Eleanor said. About your investigation. About the ring. About the map. About Lucas. The shadows of betrayal seemed to deepen, to lengthen, to engulf them. Eleanor's presence, a beacon of hope and healing, had become another thread in Thorn's web of deceit. The safe house, their sanctuary, felt suddenly vulnerable, exposed. The lines between friend and foe, between protector and prey, were blurring, and Catherine realized that their fight for justice had become a fight for survival. Chapter 16. The Soldier's Return and the Widow's Choice. We need to get you out of here, Alexander said to Eleanor, his voice urgent. Thorn knows you're connected to us. He'll come after you again. Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with fear, but also with a flicker of defiance. I won't be intimidated, she said. I won't let him use me to hurt you. He already has, Catherine said, her voice filled with anger and guilt. She felt responsible for Eleanor's involvement, for the danger she was now facing. It's not your fault, Eleanor said, sensing Catherine's distress. You didn't know. You couldn't have predicted this. We need to find Thorn, Alexander said, before he hurts anyone else, before he disappears forever. Mr. Davies, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. I've received some information, he said, from my contacts, about Thorn's allies, his network. He spread out a map of Paris on the small table, pointing to various locations.
He has safe houses, he said.
Business fronts. Connections within the underworld. He's well protected. But he has a weakness, Catherine said, her mind racing. He's greedy. He's driven by profit. He won't abandon his operations. His investments. The shipment, Alexander said, remembering the information from the informant in the bar. The arms and munitions. He'll be vulnerable, while he's overseeing it. But we don't know where it is, Catherine said. The hospital was a dead end. Suddenly, Eleanor spoke up, her voice hesitant. The young man, she said. My patient. He used to work for Thorn. Before he was injured.
He knows things.
About Thorn's operations. About his secrets.
Can he talk?
Alexander asked. Is he well enough? Eleanor nodded.
He's recovering, she said.
He's strong.
And he hates Thorn.
He wants to help. It was a risky proposition, relying on the information from a former associate of Thorn's, a man who had been injured, who might be unreliable. But it was their only lead, their only chance to find Thorn before it was too late. They decided to return to Eleanor's clinic, to speak to her patient, to see if he could provide them with the information they needed. It was a dangerous move, exposing themselves, exposing Eleanor, but they had no other choice. They arrived at the clinic under the cover of darkness, their senses on high alert. The building was quiet, deserted, the patients having been sent home for their safety. Eleanor led them to a small, private room at the back of the clinic, where her patient, a young man named Jean-Luc, lay in bed, his arm bandaged, his face pale but determined. Jean-Luc listened intently as they explained the situation, as they told him about Lucas, about Captain Ashton, about Project Nightingale, about Thorn's betrayal. He nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. I know him, he said, his voice hoarse. I know what he's capable of. He's a monster. He hesitated, his gaze meeting Eleanor's. I can help you, he said. I know where he'll be. Tonight. He told them about a warehouse, near the docks, where Thorn was expecting a shipment of arms and munitions. It was a different location from the abandoned hospital, a new lead, a new opportunity to catch Thorn. He'll be there, Jean-Luc said, with his inner circle, his most trusted men. He's paranoid. He doesn't trust anyone else. It was a trap, a dangerous gamble. But it was also their best chance, perhaps their only chance, to bring Thorn to justice. They had to do it. The decision made, a strange sense of calm came over Catherine. It made her think back to Lucas's letters, the forced joviality, the brave face put on for her benefit. And in a moment of clarity, standing between a man who was very much alive and committed to their cause, and the ghost of a husband she was fighting for, she had a choice to make. A choice that felt like a betrayal, and yet, at the same time, a liberation. The soldier's return, in the form of Alexander, had forced the widow's choice, and Catherine knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, which path she would take. Chapter 17. Whispers of Treason in the War Office. They prepared for the confrontation at the warehouse with a grim determination. Alexander checked his weapon, his movements precise, practiced. Catherine insisted on accompanying them, despite the dangers. She wouldn't be left behind. She wouldn't be sidelined. She was a part of this. She had a right to be there, to see justice done. Eleanor, despite her fear, also insisted on coming. She wouldn't abandon Jean-Luc, her patient, her friend, the man who had risked his life to help them. She also felt a responsibility, a need to be a part of the fight against Thorn, the man who had terrorized her, who had threatened her patience. Mr. Davies, using his contacts, arranged for backup a small team of discreet, reliable officers who could provide support, who could ensure that Thorn didn't escape again. They arrived at the warehouse under the cover of darkness, approaching the building with stealth and caution. The area was desolate, industrial, the air thick with the smell of salt water, of oil, of decay. The warehouse was large, imposing, with high walls and few windows. It was a fortress, a stronghold, a place where Thorn felt safe, where he conducted his illicit activities. Alexander, using his military experience, identified a potential entry point, a small, loading dock at the rear of the building, partially hidden from view. They moved silently, cautiously, their senses on high alert. They could hear the sounds of activity inside the warehouse, the murmur of voices, the clang of metal, the movement of crates. They reached the loading dock, finding the door unlocked. Alexander signaled them to wait.
He peered inside, his weapon drawn.
He saw several men, armed and alert, moving around the warehouse, guarding the shipment. Thorn was there, standing near a large table, examining a map, giving orders. He was surrounded by his inner circle, his most trusted men, just as Jean-Luc had predicted. Alexander motioned to Catherine, Eleanor, and Mr. Davies to follow him. They slipped inside, closing the door behind them. They moved quickly, silently, taking cover behind a stack of crates. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they had the element of surprise. Alexander planned to create a diversion, to draw Thorn's men away from him, allowing Catherine and Mr. Davies to approach Thorn, to confront him, to capture him. He whispered his plan to them, his voice low and urgent. They nodded, their faces grim, determined. Alexander moved out from behind the crates, firing his weapon into the air. The sound echoed through the warehouse, startling Thorn's men. Chaos erupted. The men turned, firing their weapons, unsure of where the shots had come from. Alexander used the confusion to his advantage. He moved quickly, dodging behind crates, firing at Thorn's men, drawing them away from the center of the warehouse. Catherine and Mr. Davies, taking advantage of the diversion, moved towards Thorn, their weapons drawn. Eleanor stayed close to Jean-Luc, who was hidden amongst the crates, providing what cover she could. Thorn, seeing Catherine and Mr. Davies approaching, turned, his eyes widening in surprise, then anger. "You," he said, his voice filled with venom. "You just won't give up." "It's over, Thorn," Catherine said, her voice firm, unwavering. "We know everything. You're finished." Thorn smiled, a cruel, cynical smile. "You think so?" he said. "I have friends. In high places. They won't let you take me." He reached for weapon, but before he could fire it, a shot rang out, fired from a shadowy corner of the building. Thorn flinched and howled in pain, looking down at the new wound in disbelief. Mr. Davies stepped forward, his pistol still smoking. "Your friends can't help you now," he said. "You're under arrest." Thorn's men, seeing their leader captured, seeing the arrival of more armed officers, surrendered, dropping their weapons. The confrontation was over. Thorn, the traitor, the murderer, the man who had caused so much pain and suffering, had been captured. But as Catherine looked around the warehouse, at the faces of the captured men, at the crates filled with weapons, at the evidence of Thorn's betrayal, she felt a nagging sense of unease. Something wasn't right. She noticed a small, wooden box sitting on the table next to the map Thorn had been examining. It was intricately carved, familiar. It was the box that had contained Lucas's letters. She rushed over to the box, opening it. It was empty. "Where are they?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Where are the letters?" Thorn, his face contorted with pain, smiled.
"Gone," he said.
"Destroyed. You'll never find them. The letters. The evidence of Lucas's involvement, of Captain Ashton's investigation, of Project Nightingale, they were gone. Thorn had destroyed them, erasing the final traces of his crimes. Or so he thought. For as Catherine looked from Thorn to the box and finally to Alexander, she knew this was not over. Not by a long shot. She remembered snippets of conversations with Mr. Davies, offhand remarks, unexplained absences. He was former intelligence, yes, but which intelligence? Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Chapter 18. A promise broken. A love rekindled. Catherine's gaze locked onto Mr. Davies, her mind racing, piecing together the fragmented clues, the inconsistencies, the nagging doubts that had been lurking in the back of her mind. His convenient appearances, his access to information, his ability to smooth things over with the authorities, it all added up to a disturbing conclusion. You, she said, her voice barely a whisper, her finger pointing at Mr. Davies. You're one of them. You're working with Thorn. Mr. Davies' expression didn't change. He remained calm, composed, his eyes meeting hers with a chilling detachment. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice smooth, unruffled. The letters, Catherine said, her voice trembling with anger. Lucas's letters.
You knew about them.
You knew about Project Nightingale. You were the leak. Alexander, who had been securing Thorn's men, turned, his eyes widening in disbelief. He looked from Catherine to Mr. Davies, his mind struggling to grasp the implications of her accusation. Davies? He said, his voice questioning. Is this true? Mr. Davies smiled, a cold, cynical smile. It seems my cover is blown, he said. Yes, Catherine. You're perceptive. I am impressed.
But why?
Catherine asked, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and bewilderment. Why would you betray your country? Why would you help Thorn? Mr. Davies shrugged. Loyalty is a fluid concept, he said. In this business, one must adapt.
Survive.
Thorn offered me a better deal. A share of the profits. A chance to escape the constraints of official service. You used us, Alexander said, his voice filled with disgust. You manipulated us. You put us in danger. Mr. Davies laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You were useful, he said. A convenient distraction. A way to eliminate Thorn's rivals. To consolidate my position. He reached inside his coat, pulling out a small, silver object. It was Lucas's locket. Catherine gasped, her eyes widening in horror. The locket, she said. You took it. From the hospital. You knew what was inside. Mr. Davies nodded. The coded message, he said. It was incomplete. Thorn had the other half. We needed both pieces. To decipher the full message. What was in the message? Alexander asked, his voice tight with anger. The names, Mr. Davies replied. The names of everyone involved in Project Nightingale. A list of agents, informants, collaborators. A valuable commodity. In the right hands. He smiled, a cruel, triumphant smile. And now I have it all, he said. The complete message. The locket. The power. He raised the locket, holding it up, taunting them. Thank you, Catherine, he said, for leading me to it. You were most helpful. Catherine felt a surge of rage, a raw, visceral anger that consumed her. She lunged at Mr. Davies, her hands outstretched, trying to grab the locket. But he was too quick. He stepped back, raising his pistol, pointing it at her.
Don't be foolish, Catherine, he said.
It's over. You've lost. Suddenly, a shot rang out. But it wasn't Mr. Davies' pistol. Eleanor, who had been standing silently nearby, watching the scene unfold, had picked up a discarded weapon from one of Thorn's men. She had fired, her aim true. Mr. Davies gasped, clutching his chest, his eyes widening in surprise, then pain. He staggered backward, dropping the locket, dropping the pistol. He collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing. He was dead. The locket lay on the floor, gleaming in the dim light. Catherine rushed over to it, picking it up, clutching it to her chest. Alexander, his face etched with shock and relief, went to Eleanor, checking to see if she was all right. She was shaken, trembling, but unharmed. It's over, Catherine said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. It's finally over. But as Alexander took her in his arms, there in the dusty warehouse, surrounded by the aftermath of betrayal and violence, She knew in her heart that while one chapter had closed, another was just beginning. A promise had been broken, the promise of trust, the promise of loyalty, the promise of a world where good always triumphed over evil. But a love, tentative and fragile, had been rekindled, a love born of shared grief, of shared danger, of shared purpose. And as they held each other, the weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by a glimmer of hope, a whisper of a future they might, just might, build together. Chapter 19. The Scars of War, the Bonds of the Heart. The aftermath of the warehouse confrontation was a blur of activity. Police investigations, official inquiries, the unraveling of Thorne's network, the recovery of stolen documents, the arrest of his collaborators. Catherine, Alexander, and Eleanor were hailed as heroes. Their bravery, their persistence, their unwavering commitment to justice lauded by the authorities. But beneath the surface of the official accolades, there were deeper, more personal reckonings. The scars of war, both physical and emotional, were laid bare. The bonds of the heart, tested by betrayal and loss, were strengthened, redefined. Catherine, finally free from the burden of the mystery surrounding Lucas's death, found herself facing a new challenge, confronting her feelings for Alexander. The ghost of Lucas, her beloved husband, still lingered, a presence she could never fully erase. But the love she felt for Alexander, a love born of shared grief, of shared danger, of shared purpose, was undeniable, a force that could no longer be ignored. Alexander, too, struggled with his emotions. He had carried the guilt of surviving Ypres, the burden of Captain Ashton's death, the weight of his own wartime experiences. He had found solace in Catherine's presence, in her strength, in her unwavering spirit. He had fallen in love with her, deeply, profoundly, but he hesitated to express his feelings, fearing that he was betraying Lucas's memory, that he was unworthy of Catherine's love. One evening, as they sat together in Catherine's small Paris apartment, the silence between them thick with unspoken emotions, Catherine decided to break the impasse. "Alexander," she said, her voice soft but firm, "we need to talk." He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and longing. He knew what was coming, the conversation he had been both dreading and desiring. "About Lucas?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Catherine nodded. "About Lucas," she said.
"And about us."
She reached out, taking his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. The contact sent a shiver of warmth through her, a reassurance, a confirmation of the connection they shared. "I loved Lucas," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I will always love him.
He was a part of me, a part of my life,
a part of my heart." Alexander nodded, his gaze understanding, his own grief mirroring hers. "But he's gone," Catherine continued. And I'm still here. And I found something unexpected, something precious." She looked at him, her eyes searching his, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I've fallen in love with you, Alexander," she said, her voice barely a whisper. And I know it's complicated. And I know it soon. But I can't deny it. I can't pretend it's not there." Alexander's breath caught in his throat. He had longed to hear those words, to know that his feelings were reciprocated, but he had also feared them, feared the implications, feared the betrayal of Lucas's memory. He squeezed her hand, his gaze holding hers. "Catherine," he said, his voice husky with emotion. I love you too. More than words can say. But I felt unworthy.
Guilty.
Like I was betraying Lucas. Betraying my friend." "You're not betraying anyone," Catherine said, her voice firm. "Lucas would want you to be happy. He would want us to be happy. He wouldn't want us to live in the past. He wouldn't want us to deny ourselves the chance of love." She leaned closer, her forehead touching his.
"We've been through so much," she said.
"We've faced so much darkness. We deserve a little light. We deserve a chance at happiness." Alexander closed his eyes, his heart overflowing with emotion. He had carried the burden of guilt, of grief, for too long. He had denied himself the possibility of love, of happiness, for fear of betraying the past. But Catherine's words, her love, her unwavering belief in him, had broken through the walls he had built around his heart. He was free. Free to love, free to live, free to embrace the future. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative touch, a gentle exploration, a promise of what was to come. The kiss deepened, a passionate embrace, a merging of souls, a healing of wounds. The scars of war remained, but the bonds of the heart, forged in the crucible of loss and betrayal, had triumphed. The past was not forgotten, but the future, a future filled with love, with hope, with the promise of happiness, beckoned. Chapter 20. The Reckoning at Dawn. The decision to return to England was made quietly, a shared understanding between Catherine and Alexander. Paris, with its bittersweet memories, with its shadows of betrayal, had served its purpose. It was time to go home, to face the future, to build a new life together. They booked passage on a ship crossing the Channel, their departure shrouded in a sense of closure, of anticipation, of a quiet hope for what lay ahead. They had left behind the ghosts of the war, the remnants of Project Nightingale, the lingering threat of Thorne's network. They had found justice for Lucas, for Captain Ashton, for all those who had been betrayed. They had also found something unexpected, something precious, a love that had blossomed amidst the ruins of the past. As they stood on the deck of the ship, watching the coastline of France recede into the distance, Catherine felt a sense of peace, of contentment, that she hadn't experienced in years. The sea air was crisp, invigorating, carrying the scent of salt and the promise of a new beginning. Alexander stood beside her, his arm around her waist, his presence a source of comfort, of strength, of unwavering support. He, too, seemed to have found a measure of peace, the lines of tension around his eyes easing, the haunted look in his gaze replaced by a flicker of hope. "What will you do?" Catherine asked, her voice soft, breaking the silence. "When we get back to England." Alexander smiled, a genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "I haven't thought that far ahead," he said. "But I know I want to be with you. Wherever you are. Whatever you do." Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart overflowing with love. "I want to be with you too," she said. "Always." They stood in silence for a while, watching the waves, the seagulls, the endless expanse of the sky. The journey ahead was uncertain, but they faced it together, their love a beacon, a guiding light, a promise of a future they would build, brick by painstaking brick. As the ship approached the English coast, the white cliffs of Dover rising majestically from the sea, Catherine felt a sense of homecoming, a feeling of returning to her roots, to the place where her life had begun, where her heart had been broken, and where, unexpectedly, it had been healed. But before they could fully embrace their new life, there was one final reckoning, one last loose end to tie up. Mr. Davies' betrayal had revealed a deeper rot within the intelligence community, a network of corruption that reached far beyond Thorne's operations. There were others involved, others who had profited from the war, who had betrayed their country, who had escaped justice. Alexander, using his contacts, his knowledge of the intelligence world, had gathered information, evidence, names. He had compiled a dossier, a damning indictment of the corruption that had festered within the War Office, within the very heart of the British government. He had decided to expose it, to bring the truth to light, to ensure that those responsible were held accountable. It was a risky undertaking, a dangerous mission, but he felt a duty, a responsibility, to do what was right, to honor the memory of those who had been betrayed, to prevent such atrocities from happening again. Catherine, despite her desire for a quiet life, for a peaceful existence, supported him fully. She understood his need for justice, his commitment to truth, his unwavering sense of honor. She would stand by him, whatever the cost. They arranged a meeting with a trusted journalist, a man known for his integrity, his courage, his willingness to expose corruption, to challenge the powerful. They presented him with the dossier, with the evidence, with the names. The journalist was shocked, appalled, but also determined. He promised to investigate, to verify the information, to publish the story, to expose the truth to the world. The reckoning was coming. A reckoning at dawn, a cleansing of the shadows, a revelation of the secrets that had been hidden for too long. The price of truth, they knew, could be high, but they were prepared to pay it together. For only in the light of truth could true healing begin, could a new world, a better world, be built upon the ruins of the old. As the sun rose, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, they knew their journey was far from over, but they faced it hand in hand, their love a shield, their courage a weapon, their hope a beacon in the dawn. Epilogue. The publication of the article was a bombshell, a seismic shock that reverberated through the halls of power, through the corridors of the War Office, through the very fabric of British society. The names, the details, the evidence of betrayal, of corruption, of wartime profiteering, it was all laid bare, exposed to the scrutiny of the public, to the judgment of history. There were denials, of course, attempts to discredit the journalist, to suppress the story, to silence the voices of dissent. But it was too late. The truth was out, and it could not be contained. Investigations were launched, inquiries were held, arrests were made. The network of corruption, the web of deceit that had festered within the intelligence community, was slowly, painstakingly unraveled. Those responsible, the men who had betrayed their country, who had profited from the war, who had escaped justice for too long, were finally held accountable. Catherine and Alexander watched the events unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but the scars of the past remained, a reminder of the lives lost, of the sacrifices made, of the enduring consequences of war. They had played their part. They had fulfilled their duty. They had honored the memory of those who had been betrayed. Now it was time to move on, to build a new life, to embrace the future. They left London, seeking a quieter existence, a place to heal, to find peace, to cultivate the love that had blossomed amidst the ruins of the past. They settled in a small cottage in the countryside, surrounded by rolling hills, by green fields, by the tranquility of nature. Catherine returned to her books, finding solace in the familiar comfort of literature, in the predictable order of knowledge. She also started writing her own story, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the power of love, to the enduring hope for a better world. Alexander, having left behind the world of espionage, found a new purpose in working the land, in cultivating the earth, in finding a connection to the natural rhythms of life. He also used his skills, his knowledge, his experience to help other veterans, to support those who were struggling to adjust to civilian life, to find a place in a world that had changed irrevocably. They built a life together, a life filled with love, with companionship, with shared purpose. They adopted a dog, a stray they found wandering near their cottage, a creature that had known its own share of hardship, of loss, but who, like them, had found a home, a haven, a place to belong. Years passed, the seasons turning, the memories of the war fading, but never fully disappearing. The scars remained, a reminder of the past, but also a testament to their strength, to their resilience, to their enduring love. One autumn afternoon, as they sat together on the porch of their cottage, watching the sunset paint the sky with hues of orange and gold, Catherine reached for Alexander's hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We did it," she said, her voice soft, filled with a quiet contentment. "We found our way, through the darkness, to the light." Alexander smiled, his blue eyes reflecting the golden glow of the setting sun. "We did," he agreed. "Together." He leaned in, kissing her gently, a tender expression of a love that had endured, a love that had triumphed, a love that had blossomed amidst the ruins of war, a love that would last a lifetime. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a familiar, comforting aroma that spoke of home, of peace, of a future built on the foundations of a shared past, a shared grief, a shared love. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they knew that their journey, though marked